So the last category we're going to talk about is discipline. When we talk about performance management, the first couple categories we talked about in terms of pay for performance, or we talked about the purpose of performance appraisals. We addressed the issue of specifically someone who's not performing the tasks appropriately, and so we need to engage in some sort of intervention through goal setting and performance management tools, pay for performance or incentives in order to improve their everyday work performance with the tasks. Discipline is different than that. Discipline is really about rules violations and not managing the company policies the way that they're supposed to. It really doesn't have anything to do with someone who is capable or incapable of performing the tasks, but more about, do they follow the company rules? Do they follow the company policies? And are they in a place where they will continue to misbehave? So discipline is about intervening with those misbehaviors and those rule violations and getting them to perform in a way that we want them to perform. So when we think about different kinds of discipline, our focus with discipline, and this is a big part of the coaching stuff, is how do we get the rule violations to be managed better so that people can ultimately go back to the high levels of performance that we want, so that we make sure that the work environment is pleasant for everybody, that we avoid any illegal or unethical behaviors that are not appropriate, and we keep people focused on their tasks, right? And that's the goal. So the basic standards of discipline require three major things. Number one, that we communicate the rules up front. People have to know what to expect before you can set them free and say, now go and perform. And you certainly can't punish them if they didn't know that rules existed. So it's the job of the company, the HR professional, the boss, the manager, to communicate what the company rules are around all sorts of different issues, attendance and lunch times and how your desk should look and what's appropriate at your desk and what's not, how loud music can be, what's your dress code, all those sorts of things. We set clear expectations, we set the standard for what we expect, and then we give the employee the feedback on that, and we give them the information on that. The clearest way that we can give them the rules of behavior is through an orientation program and through the employee manual, where the employee manual goes through really clear details what's to be expected on different company rules. So once we've communicated those rules, then we can call people to task for not following them, but you certainly can't do that if they are not aware of the rules in the first place. Then we need to document the facts. Then we need to spend time going through and doing our investigation and making sure we have all the facts involved in whatever the poor behavior is. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to be sure that we're doing this in a due process manner. That'll be on the next slide. But we want to make sure that we're documenting everything, and everything should be written down. Even if you doubt it, you're not sure, whether or not it's something to pay attention to, you should document it anyway, because it can always be removed if it's not relevant. But if it's relevant, then we want to make sure we have everything added. The last item in terms of the basic standards of discipline is making sure we are consistent in the way that we respond to rule violations. It's very important that we treat everybody the same, or we treat them relatively the same, fairly. If someone is late for work, we call them to task for being late to work. The next person is late to work, we also need to take them to task for being late. If we forgive somebody being late and tell them it's not a problem, be late as much as you want, or we don't address it at all, then we need to be fair and do that for everybody, because your employees see those inconsistencies, and they will make judgments on whether or not the organization is behaving fairly, or that you as a manager are behaving fairly. So make sure that if you're going to enforce a rule, that it's enforced for everybody, and if you're going to waive a rule, it's waived for everybody, that there's no exceptions to those rules. Largely, discipline can be done in a whole lot of different ways, but the most effective way, and the way that is typically supported the most by courts of law, is a progressive disciplinary process. We start with a verbal warning. It doesn't go in someone's permanent record, but we can note, that a verbal warning was given to somebody on a such and such a date. And if they did not make changes, if they don't improve, then we can go to a written warning. That's strike two. And then if the written warning, they still are, with the written warning, they still are engaging in the bad behaviors that we're not interested in seeing, then we can decide whether or not another written warning is appropriate or a suspension would be appropriate after that. And companies can make whatever policy they want on that. And the goal of the progressive policy is it starts with a friendly intervention, right? This is not appropriate, so we need to fix this. Then the next step in the process is we put it in writing. And then the next step after that is it gets more and more harsh, then they get suspended. And then lastly, they can get discharged, depending on, obviously, the violation. So we want to have a very clear, progressive plan in place when we start to see company violations. So, for example, you see an employee is very sloppy at their desk and they always eat at their desk and they leave messes, right? Well, I mean, is there a company rule against that? Maybe or maybe not, but it's still inappropriate and it really interferes with the work environment. So we can work with HR to come up with a progressive plan. Then we go in, we give the verbal warning and the written warning, and then we decide whatever appropriate sanction is appropriate for that individual. And we may just decide you don't get to eat at your desk anymore. You have to go eat in the lunchroom, or you have to go out to eat, or you have to find some place to do it. You may not have food at your desk. And that might be as harsh as we get. I mean, I think we have to be really careful, as we'll see in the next page, of making sure that the punishment for a misbehavior in the workplace is appropriate for the misbehavior, right? We don't want to fire someone because they had a taco at their office desk, right? So the progressive discipline is our way of making sure we've got good documentation, that we have a track record of trying to help the employee improve the behavior, that we talk about what we did and how we engaged in it, and then we just build it from there, step by step. The last page we're talking about is the due process part of this. How do we ensure that our investigation, our method of discipline, our standards of discipline are fair, and that we're going to give everybody involved due process? And so the first thing we need to do is make sure that we have clear notification. When someone has done a misdeed or they have misbehaved, we want to make sure we notify them first. And that may be all we need. That's sort of that verbal warning. We've notified them. This is an issue. This is a concern. We're following this. Then we need to move into what we call as the reasonable rule, right? And, is it reasonable to expect someone to behave in that way given the circumstances? Is it reasonable for us to intervene given also those circumstances? And so we want to make sure that our response is reasonable, its response is in alignment, and that the behavior is appropriate or inappropriate in a reasonable manner. Once we're done with the reasonable rule, we have to make sure that we are investigating prior to discipline. So it may be okay for us at times to say, look, we have a circumstance, we do need to investigate this. We're going to suspend you with pay. We need you to be away from the work environment so that we can properly investigate this. But the person's not necessarily being disciplined. They're just being separated from the circumstance so a proper investigation can be done. And this may be something very egregious, right? We certainly don't want to do this for somebody who, left a taco wrapper on their desk, or someone who was late for 5 minutes in the workplace. But we might want to do this for something much more egregious, a sexual harassment violation or an ethical violation or something along that line. I'm going to suspend you with pay. We're going to do our investigation. It doesn't give the opportunity for someone to cover their tracks and fake, results so that shows that they didn't do something. And this way we can have a really clear investigation. But we have to investigate before we mete out whatever the punishment is. So before we can say you are punished for this and you're going to be docked pay, or you're going to be suspended, or you're going to be fired, we want to make sure there's a really fair investigation that's done with all appropriate information gathered in an unbiased way, right? Because we want to make sure that it's fair, not just for the victims of whatever the violation is. And there may be circumstances where a disciplinary procedure has a victim. And it also may be that there's a disciplinary procedure without a victim. So we have to be fair to the victims if there are them, but we also have to be fair to the person who did the violation or the alleged violation. So we want to be fair to all people involved. We need to make sure before we move forward with that disciplinary action that we have proof of guilt. And we have a clear guideline in our employee manual. It says when you do this behavior, this is what the outcome will be. And when we see that behavior, then that outcome has to happen. But we have to have concrete proof that the the misdeed occurred. So we need to have proof of guilt. We also want to make sure that it's absent of discrimination, that we're not treating someone differently because of their race or sex or orientation or anything along that line. And there may be times, as we know from implicit associations and implicit biases, that we may be treating someone differently and we don't even recognize it. It's not necessarily intended, and it doesn't have to be intended in order for you to still perceive someone differently because of their race or sex or orientation. And we've talked about the implicit association in class. So we want to really self-examine in those circumstances where we're ready to go forward with some disciplinary procedure. We need to ask ourselves, would I do this if this person was straight? Would I do the same thing if this person was a male? Would I do the same thing if this person was a female? Would I do this same thing if this person was white instead of Latino? And the goal here is we are taking a few moments to check our own biases at the door, making sure that we are not treating this person, even if it's inadvertently, treating them differently because of those things. And again, we know enough about implicit associations to know that that could be a very big problem. So we make the decision to prosecute this person for whatever their penalty is, whatever their problem is that they've engaged in misbehavior. We make sure, lastly, that we have a reasonable penalty. Again, to make sure that the penalty is in alignment with the crime or with the misdeed. Again, we don't fire someone for leaving a taco wrapper on their desk, but we need to have an appropriate response for that. So you can use a progressive disciplinary procedure that doesn't have to end in discharge. It can end in, well, you don't get to eat at your desk anymore because you're a slob. That would be an appropriate response. And so the goal here is making sure that we are not making a punishment that's greater than the misdeed itself, and that we're making sure that those things are in alignment. So in summary, we've talked a lot about performance management in this material. We've talked about the role of the performance appraisal and how it helps us with keeping people in alignment in terms of performance, and then we can use it for developmental purposes, and we use training and development to help them with that. We can also use this to help with disciplinary procedures, and we will give disciplinary feedback during a disciplinary procedure, during a performance appraisal. It's okay for us to be able to do that because we need to reiterate that these disciplinary misbehaviors do affect their overall performance evaluation, and it's different than their task evaluation. It's how they perform relative to the company rules and policies and culture. If they're violating those rules, policies, and cultures, that doesn't make them a good employee, a good citizen. And so it's okay for us to talk about disciplinary procedures in the performance appraisal, but it's extra. It's beyond just task performance, as I said. Pay for performance, as we talked about, is one of the key areas that managers have the greatest impact on managing performance, and by using compensation, because they can assess workers based on how well they're performing, and they create the rewards that are accordingly. And they'll work hand in hand with HR within the boundary of budgets and what's available to them. But they have to determine bonuses and merit pay, with HR's guidance, and also work on creating and deciding what incentives are going to be appropriate to get the behaviors that they want. So managers' roles in this whole process of HR is in performance management is they're the front line on performance management. They're the ones that are there up front working with the employee. They're going to have the greatest impact on changing their performance and their behaviors. HR's job is to train the manager, to train the employees, to make sure that everybody understands the rules, and they have management's back when management says, I need to prosecute, we have a problem. This person's not behaving appropriately, and I need a plan for how to deal with that. And that's your job, is to go in and to make that happen as an HR professional. So if you have any other questions, let me know.